Okay, welcome to Word Without Walls. Welcome to the Wednesday night sunlight service. The title of tonight's message is Unbound Part 1. And I wasn't necessarily going to, I had that thought in my brain about being unbound. And I wasn't necessarily going to make a sermon series out of it, but when I started digging into it, there's way too much. I think it's way too important. So we're going to spend a couple of weeks here. We're going to spend some time here because the truth of the matter is a lot of people spend most of their lives bound by things. We let things hold us down. We let things hold us back. We let things drag us down. We don't know what has happened necessarily, and we don't know what it means that it has happened. And so we struggle and we try our best, and sometimes it doesn't always work out because, again, we try our best without realizing that Jesus already did His best. And really that's where we're going to focus tonight. We're almost going to kind of do it backwards. We're going to focus tonight on the truth that we are not bound anymore by anything. And we're going to look at how that's true and why that's true. And then we're going to spend the next couple of weeks kind of looking at all the different things that we can find ourselves in bondage to. And again, starting from we're unbound. So when we look at the things that can affect us, we're looking at it in the light of these things can affect us, but they don't have to. So my key verse for tonight that I really want us to just stick in our head, and this is our foundation that we're going to build this whole sermon series on. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. And in the King James Bible it reads like this. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. Okay, and that word liberty is number 1657 in Strong's Greek Concordance, and it simply means freedom. And I think it's important that we understand that because even in this country, you know, one of the building blocks, as it were, of this country is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is one of the things that we base a lot of our thinking on. We base a lot of our lives on. But really, we're not experiencing it the way that we oftentimes should. And I think that's because we don't understand where the Spirit of the Lord is. Of course, it's inside of us. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And then we don't always necessarily understand what the Spirit of the Lord being present in us and around us and as us and through us. We don't always understand just quite exactly what that means. But again, what it means is where the Spirit is, there's liberty, there's freedom. And then if you read that verse in the Amplified Bible, it's pretty much exactly the same. It says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. And then it adds emancipation from bondage or freedom. And again, that's where we're starting from. We're starting from the truth that while we were in bondage, we have been emancipated from bondage. We are unbound. All of the things of the earth that try to drag us down, all of the world screaming at us and trying to define us and tell us who we are and tell us who we need to be, none of that stuff compares to the still, small voice inside of us speaking the truth. And again, that's where we're starting from tonight. We're starting from this idea of we have been freed. We have been emancipated. We were in bondage to sin and death. And then 2,000 years ago the cross happened. And now we are free. Because now the Spirit lives in us. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. There is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is emancipation from bondage. So the bondage of sin and death can no longer hold us back because we've been freed from it. That's our focus tonight. And then in the next couple of weeks we're really going to start to look at some of the different kinds of bondage and some of the different kinds of ways that we have been freed from so that we can stop fighting things. And as we're going to see, I think next week in the book of Hebrews, instead of fighting things, we can just start laying some things aside. We can just start letting go of some things. But I want to read this week in Hebrews chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 13 through 15. And in the King James, Hebrews 2, starting with verse 13, reads like this. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given me. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So again, and really I don't think this is news to anybody. I think we know that a lot of times we're subject to bondage. A lot of times we have things in our life that hold us down or hold us back. Sometimes it feels like a ball and chain wrapped around you, like you can't move forward. Or it feels like a hamster wheel where you're just running in place and you're running and you're running and you're trying as hard as you can to get where you're going, but you never get anywhere. And again, where does it come from? It says through fear. And we're going to look at that again probably next week or maybe the week after. But the cure for fear is love. Because perfect love casts out fear. There's no fear in love. How did he defeat this bondage, this slavery, as it were? He did it by becoming just like we were. We are flesh and blood. He became flesh and blood, and then he died, so that everything that had a hold on us died. It no longer has a hold on us. And the Bible talks about in great length about how the law only has authority over a man if he's alive. So once the man dies, then all that old stuff no longer has a hold of him. And then after he died, both for us and as us, remember Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. And he was speaking of his death. When Jesus was lifted up on the cross, he drew us all into himself. And from that point on, what happened to him happened to us. So when he died, we died. And then, just like that, we were free from all this stuff. And then 3 days later, when he rose again, we rose again. To walk in newness of life. To walk above this stuff. And I think it's Hebrews again that when it talks about, we know all this stuff is under our feet. But we don't always see it that way. But we see Jesus. When we see his finished work, then we can stop trying to finish the work. When we see what he has done, we can rest. And we can enjoy the fruit of his labor. And the fruit of his labor is the fruit of the Spirit, which is love. Because of what he did, we don't have to earn love anymore. Because of what he did, we are free to receive God's love, and we are free to love one another with that love. That's what that verse means in 2 Corinthians when it talks about where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. We're free from a lot of things, but we're also free to do a lot of things. And I think it's important that we look at both of them, and that's why I'm turning this into a series instead of just a one-off message. So let me read it in the Message Bible. I'm just going to read verses 14 and 15 in Hebrews chapter 2 in the Message Bible. It reads like this. Since the children are made of flesh and blood, it's logical that the Savior took on flesh and blood in order to rescue them by his death. By embracing death, taking it into himself, he destroyed the devil's hold on death and freed all who cower through life, scared to death of death. And I think that's really one of the biggest points when we're talking about bondage, when we're talking about being emancipated from bondage. Being scared to death of death, I think is one of the things that holds us back the most. Being scared of death stops us from living. Okay? Being afraid of a mistake stops us oftentimes from trying anything. And if you're not trying it, if you're too afraid of a mistake to try anything, if you're too afraid of death to live, then you're going to completely miss out on everything that's available to you. Okay? It's like, in a similar sense, it's like when Jesus spoke about the sheepfold, and he said, anybody who tries to get in any other way but the door is a thief and a robber. He was talking about us robbing ourselves from the gift that we've been given. And if the gift that we've been given is eternal life, then the way that we rob ourselves from that gift is by trying to earn something that is freely given. By being so afraid of death that we don't even live. And that's why he gave us his life. See, again, he died and we died. And then he rose again and we rose again. but not just back to regular life, to his life. He gave his life for us, and he gave his life to us. His abundant, eternal, everlasting resurrection life. He equipped and empowered us to walk in newness of life by giving us his Spirit. Because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's emancipation from bondage. When you have that, when you know that you have that light inside of you, that life inside. Remember, I think it was last week we were talking about the light and the life. When you have that much life inside of you, there's no room for death. When you have that love and you know and believe that love is inside of you, then there's no room for fear. Then you can love fearlessly. You can live fearlessly. You're free from a lot of things, and you're free to a lot of things. You're free from sin and death. You're free to live in love. Because to live is to love, and to love is to live. Life and love and light and spirit and fire, they're all the same thing. It's all God. They're all pictures of the same thing. So now let's look at Romans chapter 8. And this is my main passage for tonight. I want to read verses 9 through 17, and I know that's a lot, and I try to stay away from big chunks of scripture if I can. But anytime I get into Romans, I just get so caught up because Romans is so good. So I want to read a lot of it. And again, I want to build a pretty sound foundation this week. And then really kind of go into a lot of this stuff and expand on it in the foreseeable future. But I want to read Romans chapter 8, starting with verse 9. In the King James Version, it reads like this. And to preface this, remember, we just saw in Hebrews that because we were flesh and blood, Jesus became flesh and blood. But now it says, Romans chapter 8 verse 9, it says, but ye are not in the flesh. So there's a difference between flesh and blood and being in the flesh. It says, but ye are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. If so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. And if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. So all that stuff that the body or the earth was bound to, remember Adam was made from the dust of the earth, and he was earthy, the first Adam, and then the last Adam, Jesus, was the Spirit from heaven. There's a huge difference between the old man who is dead and gone and buried and buried in the watery grave of baptism. There's a big difference between the old man and the new man, okay? And we're talking about the new. We're not in bondage anymore. Something happened on the cross, and what happened is we were freed, or again, emancipated from bondage. So all that stuff that used to apply no longer applies. Because again it says, the body is dead because of sin. So we're dead to all that stuff that the body was connected to. We're dead to the lusts of the flesh. We're dead to all of that. The world screaming at us, we don't have to listen to it anymore. We're dead to the lie because we know the truth. Okay? But the Spirit is life because of righteousness. Verse 11, it goes on, it says, but if the Spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, he that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by his Spirit that dwelleth in you. Again, he drew us into himself. He died. We died. He rose again. We were still in him. We rose again. Okay? So it's no longer an old man trying to behave, but it's a new man with a totally new spirit. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. The new man is unbound. And we even saw this to a sense. And I know Jesus did some miraculous things before his death, burial, and resurrection, but after his death, burial, and resurrection, it's almost like he kicked it up a notch. He could walk through doors like they weren't even there. He was totally and completely unbound by the constraints of what we understand as this dimension on the earth. He did things that again, that shouldn't have been, quote unquote, humanly possible. Because he wasn't bound to being a human, he was more than that. He took his super and he put it on our natural, and he made us supernatural. And again, that's what we are. We're a spirit living inside of a body. And that's why it's so funny that, we're always trying to have a spiritual experience, when in truth we're a spirit having an earthly experience. Like we've got it backwards. And I think, again, that comes from this fear. I think it comes from being bound up with all the traditions of men, and bound up with how we think things are supposed to be, or bound up with how society tells us things are supposed to be. But it goes on and it says in verse 12, "Therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh, to live after the flesh. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye live through the Spirit, do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." And I don't think this means if I let the Spirit lead me, I become a son. I think this means I'm a son, and therefore the Spirit leads me. I think we try to get it backwards again. We try to put the cart before the horse. We try to say, okay, let me earn my sonship. Okay, let me be a son by doing this. When in fact you never, ever, ever do in order to be. You do because you be. Okay? You can't act like a son and then be a son. You're only a son because of who your father is. And again, when it talks about being led by the Spirit, I'll say it again. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So where does the Spirit lead us? Into freedom. And this is the thing that always drove me crazy. I let it drive me crazy for quite a while. This always drove me crazy. I don't even mind anymore. I don't even bother with it. But when people talked about the grace movement, and they talked about greasy grace, and they talk about grace being a license to sin, that always drove me crazy, because I was like, who needs a license to sin? Why do we think that sin is freedom, when in fact sin is bondage? I think it's in another place. I think it's in Romans. I'm pretty sure Paul wrote about it when he was discussing a man who is under the law, who wants to do good, but only does what he doesn't want to do, right? It's like you try so hard to do one thing, but you always end up doing the other thing. That's called bondage, right? I can't do anything else. I'm trapped. I'm stuck. I'm a slave to this. I guess if you want to call it sin, if you want to call it unbelief, if you want to call it quote-unquote bad behavior, whatever you want to call it, that's not freedom. If you have to do something, that's not freedom. If you get to do something, if you can do something, if you're equipped and empowered to do something, and it's in your heart to do it, and then you have freedom to do it, that's what we're talking about. Sin is not freedom, okay? Nobody needs a license to sin. Sin and death are the bondage that we were freed from. And that's why I hear a lot of preachers say grace is not freedom to sin, grace is freedom from sin. And I absolutely agree with that. Grace is this Spirit of the Lord. Grace is this liberty. Grace is, go ahead and try it. Make a mistake. Fall down and get back up 7 times. Like the just man, I think, from the book of Proverbs. Or better yet, Jesus is the one who can keep us from falling. Alright? So we just go where He leads us. We just let Him make His footsteps with our feet. We just let Him speak His words with our mouth. We just let Him be Himself in us, and therefore be our true selves. And then we don't even have to worry about falling. Because then we're on the straight and narrow path that we talked about that leads to life. So it goes on and it says, verse 14 again, "For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear." And if he's saying we haven't received it again, that means that we had it, right? And then it was taken away. We were in bondage. We were freed from bondage. We have not received the spirit of bondage again. Remember, Paul wrote in another place, "Be not conformed to this world," which means we were in the world, we were taken out of the world. Don't go back to the world, right? "But be transformed by the renewing of your mind." It says, "You have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father." So again, it's not if you let the Spirit lead you, you'll be a son. It's you've received the spirit of sonship. Now that Spirit can lead you, because now you are a son, and now you know that you are a son, and now you know what it means to be a son. Now you can stop trying to act like something you're not, and you can simply start to be who you are in Him, as he reveals to you who he is in you. Okay? It's freedom from an identity crisis. It's freedom from trying to be somebody you're not. It's freedom from religion. It's freedom from the world. It's freedom to truly be who you are instead of trying to be somebody you're not. It's freedom to enjoy what you have instead of trying to get something that you think you haven't got. It's no longer looking for love in all the wrong places. It's receiving and releasing the love that you've been given. And that's such a huge difference. It says in verse 16, "The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God." Okay? The Holy Spirit, our love receptor, is the Spirit of truth. And it leads and guides us into all truth by testifying of our true selves, by testifying of Jesus. Because he is our true self. He is our true identity. Jesus, God in the flesh, love in a body. God in our flesh, love in our body. That's who we are. And it's only by being loved that we are free to love. It's only by receiving it can we have something to give. Because you can't give what you don't have, right? How could you? But when we know what we have, when we believe that we have it, then we can give it, then we can share it. Then we're not bound by these other things. Then we're free. And it goes on and it says, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together." And again, that suffering, that's not something in your future, that's something in your past. Jesus' suffering was your suffering because you were wrapped up in him. Okay? When we see what he did, then we can stop trying to do it. When we see the work is finished, we can stop trying to finish it. And we can rest. And we can enjoy the fruit of his labor. So let me read this quickly in the Message Bible. Romans chapter 8, starting with verse 9, in the Message Bible reads like this. "But if God himself has taken up residence in your life, you can hardly be thinking more of yourself than of him. Anyone, of course, who has not welcomed this invisible but clearly present God," remember the other day we were talking about eyes to see, he's invisible but he's clearly present. We see the evidence. It says, "Anyone, of course, who has not welcomed this invisible but clearly present God, the Spirit of Christ, won't know what we're talking about. But for you who welcome him, in whom he dwells, even though you still experience all the limitations of sin, you yourself experience life on God's terms. You're not bound by your sin or unbelief anymore." Okay? We still live in this physical realm, but we're not bound by it. We still see these limitations, but we experience life on God's terms. Okay? And Jesus saw a limitation of water, but he just walked on it. Right? He wasn't bound by anything. He needed to go to the boat, so he went to the boat, and he didn't care what was in his way, because it was under his feet. Right? It says, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that if the alive and present God who raised Jesus from the dead moves into your life, he'll do the same thing in you that he did to Jesus, bringing you alive to himself? I think that stands to reason. I think God is no respecter of person. And if it's the same Spirit, wouldn't it accomplish the same goals? Didn't God say in another place that his word will not return void, but it will prosper in the thing that it set out to do? It says, "When God lives and breathes in you, and he does, as surely as he did in Jesus." And again, what that means is, when love lives and breathes in you, you are delivered from that dead life. With his Spirit living in you, your body will be as alive as Christ's. So don't you see that we don't owe this old do-it-yourself life one red cent? We're not bound by it. There's nothing in it for us. Nothing at all. The best thing to do is give it a decent burial and get on with your new life. And again, I think that's what we're going to hit next week. Just lay it aside. Just what do we always say? Just let go and let God. All right? What does Frozen say? Let it go. And then, I always say, let it flow. Let that river of living water that's inside you flow out of you. Not by forcing it out, but by filling yourself to overflowing with what you've been filled with, by receiving it and releasing it. It says, there's nothing in it for us, nothing at all. The best thing to do is give it a decent burial and get on with your new life. God's Spirit beckons. There are things to do and places to go. This resurrection life you received from God is not a timid, grave-tending life. And I think that's what it means to be in bondage. We're tending our graves. Right? There's a wonderful Easter message I heard one time about, I forget his name, the man who created the sepulcher that Jesus was buried in. Like he worked on it, he worked on it, he worked on it, and then he never even got put in there because Jesus got put in there. Okay? Jesus went to the grave for us and as us, so we don't have to mess with all that anymore. We don't have to have a timid, grave-tending life. It's adventurously expectant, greeting God with a childlike, "What's next, Papa?" God's Spirit touches our spirits and confirms who we really are. We know who He is, and we know who we are, Father and children. And we know we are going to get what's coming to us, an unbelievable inheritance. We go through exactly what Christ goes through. If we go through the hard times with Him, then we're certainly going to go through the good times with Him. And again, that suffering, it says in another place in the Bible, it talks about if you suffer with Him, you'll reign with Him. The suffering part already took place. You don't need to suffer more. You need to understand the suffering that took place. And if you understand the suffering that took place, then you can reign in life. If you understand the death that happened 2,000 years ago on the cross, then you can walk in newness of life. It's not something that needs to happen. It's something that has happened. We don't need to unbind ourselves, although, in a sense we do. We need to realize what happened. But we don't need to unbind ourselves through our own strength. We need to see that we are unbound. Okay? It doesn't say where the Spirit of the Lord is, you can get liberty if you try really hard. It says where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Because how could there be freedom and bondage in the same place? How could there be light and dark in the same place? God is light and there's no darkness in Him at all. Okay? How could there be love and fear in the same place when love casts out fear? Okay? We need to start to understand what we have and what we are so we can stop messing with all of this stuff that we don't need or that we aren't. It says, we'll certainly go through the good times with Him. Now let me close for this week with Galatians chapter 5 verse 1. And this is where I'm going to pick up next week because this is, again, I feel like I'm starting from the back, almost like a Quentin Tarantino movie where I show you the ending and then I back up and show you how we got there. Galatians chapter 5 verse 1 says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free." Past tense. He's not going to make us free. He doesn't need to make us free. He has made us free. And what we need to do is stand fast in that liberty. We need to receive that gift He's given us. And not just receive it, but release it. Okay? Share it. Enjoy it. Use it. It says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." I think that's where we get into trouble. And that's really my focus for next week. I think we're our own worst enemies. And I think we get into the most trouble in our lives when we get entangled again with the yoke of bondage. When we let stuff that has no power over us have power over us. Okay? Because if God is all powerful, that means love is all powerful. And that's not just what we have, that's not just what we can do, that's who we are. If we are love, that means we are all powerful. That means for something else to have power over us, we'd have to give it power. Because being all-powerful doesn't mean most powerful. It means all of the power. It means nothing else has any power. Okay, so this stuff that we get entangled in, we don't have to. These mountains that we make out of molehills, we don't have to. This yoke of bondage, remember, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Remember, Jesus said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." His yoke is not of bondage. His yoke is of freedom. So all this stuff that we mess around with, we don't have to mess around with. All of this stuff that we think still binds us, It doesn't. We are unbound. We have been made free because the Spirit of the Lord dwells in us. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. So that's what I have for this week. We're going to continue on this at least for the next couple of weeks, because like I said, the deeper I started to get into this, the more and more I found that I wanted to talk about. So I'm just going to spread it out a little bit. I hope we built a foundation tonight that we are free, and then we're going to look at what it means to be free, what we're free from, what we're free to, all of this stuff. We are absolutely 100% completely unbound, and that's good news. That's the gospel. So thank you, as always, for your attendance, for all your support. Thank you for helping me get the word out there. There's a new book out, the newest volume of Jesus Rants. I don't know, that's all I got for tonight. So I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Amen.